Well, sure. A man named Roger Larson, who is actually the author of this book that I'm holding here. It's a very good book that enchanted a lot of people who read it. It's been out of print for years, but it's a book that united all of these different filmmakers who came from different film clubs that were started all over New York City. But Roger's club was one of the first ones. It was on Rivington Street in the Lower East Side in New York. And it was a club that initially it was at a youth center, and the kids came to use the basketball court, and then they stayed to make films. Yeah, and there were all kinds of kids at this thing. There were kids from the bad area of town, which was pretty much Lower East Side. I mean, those days in New York, and Mike can kind of attest to this, that if you crossed certain streets, you were already in a bad neighborhood. You know, I mean, New York was very, neighborhoods in New York were very hermetic. You had the Italian neighborhood, you had the Puerto Rican neighborhood. It's not like today, where it's kind of like Disney World, if you go to the Village or the Lower East Side. But anyway, if you crossed over to the Lower East Side from the Village, there was already a noticeable difference. And so the kids who came to the Rivington Club, let's say they were a bit scruffier, a bit more troubled than kids that you would find in some of the other neighborhoods. Let's say north of 14th Street, or Houston. Yeah, these are kind of the dividing streets. The Bowery was a very important street. The Bowery is kind of historically. I mean, there are a lot of movies about it. But the Bowery was this neighborhood where all kinds of strange, dangerous things happen. It was a place for subculture. It was a place where a lot of New York artists like Andy Warhol and Shirley Clark found inspiration, derived their inspiration from. And so it was this burgeoning artist bohemia. And so these filmmakers, these young filmmakers, that was the setting where they started. Was in this horrible neighborhood, but at the same time it was a wonderful neighborhood. And out of that, Roger Larson created this great film club. It was literally a storefront he opened that said Film Club. And the kids could come in, learn how to use cameras, and they got paid to make films. So, I mean, there was nothing like that before. And whether he intended it or not, Roger initiated an entire youth film movement in the city of New York City and eventually became in the entire country. Roger wrote young filmmakers, for teenagers. He wrote it for people like me. So when I discovered the book, I was in high school, I was a teenager. In fact, when I eventually, down the line, when I talked to people about the book and its influence on me, I discovered a lot of other people had this book too. In fact, there are two filmmakers in this festival who had the book when they were younger, Andres Duque and John Vito. Both of them had this book in their school libraries. So it was a book that was distributed to young people, that librarians bought for young people, and so it got to me exactly the way that Roger had intended it to get to me. I mean, I guess, not everybody reads the book and then goes the next day and buys a Super 8 camera and starts making films. For whatever reason, that was the case with me. Well, the young filmmakers, I mean, it's difficult to... I haven't researched all of their lives, but I know in broad strokes what happened to some of them. I know that Mike, for example, Mike Jacobson, who's in the program, became a very successful editor in New York City and a documentary filmmaker. There were a lot of people who went into the industry, either with just kind of technical jobs, production jobs, or people who made their own films, made their own kind of artistically, their investment was more than just technical. And then there were people who just went back to their lives as usual. The film club, I mean, the emphasis we should put on it is that it was recreational. It was not a vocational training. It wasn't like NYU Film School. It was literally intended for these people to have fun. These kids went in there, they passed a few hours of the day, It got them away from drugs. It got them away from gangs. It got them away from their troubled domestic lives. And a lot of that is actually reflected in the films. So, for them it was, I think, you can see it up on the screen, sort of a catharsis, being able to express themselves and get that off of their plates. Because a lot of them had very unhappy lives. And that, the history after that is, unfortunately, for a lot of these young filmmakers, kind of grim. Many of them were drafted to the Vietnam War. I mean, the way it works in the U.S. is that there's a tier of people who are usually primed to be drafted. So people from lower income backgrounds, people who are high school dropouts or don't have jobs. These are the people who in the 1960s and 70s were recruited to go to Vietnam to fight in the war. And of course, most of those people died in the front lines. I know one of them actually lived past the Vietnam War and made a military career. And then those who stayed home kind of were fighting a war on their home turf. They either died because of gang-related incidents or drug abuse. So that's the kind of grim part of it, is that they really were troubled kids. And then, there were others that survived all of that. They survived the war. They survived the Lower East Side. And they're living happily today. And, I know there are a couple that Mike Jacobson studied with at the Henry Street movie settlement with a guy named Bruce Spiegel. Those people are, I saw a video with them, and, they have pretty normal lives, children, wives. Well, obviously, none of these films were made as, let's say, fully formed artistic pronouncements. So Jean Vigo, to take a very young filmmaker in France and also in kind of a wonderful Bohemia of the 1920s, made all these, great films, starting with, these shorts, one about a swimmer, Jantaris, and Zero for Conduct. And they're very free films, and they're an expression of youth, and they're an expression of kind of, let's say, a nihilistic worldview that a young person can have. And, of wanting to defy authority, of wanting to, create a utopia for themselves so they can live in that and inhabit that, in a film, because they can't do that in real life. And that is so vivid in these films. I mean, you can tell, Alfonso Sanchez Jr., this filmmaker, that, this was his fantasy world that he was living in. I mean, quite literally in the potheads in Let's Get Nice. I mean, Alfonso Sanchez was one of the titular potheads. He was one of those potheads, and it was his first, I think, 100 feet of film that he shot. That he just went up on a rooftop with his friends, and it's such a great film because it's so much about the New York landscape. I mean, you have the water towers on the buildings, and it's such a film about the Lower East Side too. You can see that landscape behind them as they're getting high, and so right there, I mean, quite literally, they found their utopia, their idealized little world. And then the next step after that would be for Alfonso to kind of fully create, deriving from fiction, deriving from fantasy, probably deriving from his own dreams, probably deriving from his own pot and other drug-induced hallucinations, a film called The End, which for me is a masterpiece. And is a film that imagines it's about a young man who, lives in his own apartment, which a lot of these kids didn't. They were either homeless on the street or they lived with their parents, and he imagines a world where suddenly marijuana is legalized, and he goes out on the street and he jumps around, and then there are all kind of moral consequences to this vision. And we see a white devil and a black devil, and they're fighting each other. We see he looks through the peephole of his door, and he sees Viet Cong soldiers coming after him. So, there are all these references to politically what was happening at the time. And what kind of surprises me about these films is that for the most part, they're very political. I mean, you can tell this was a very charged time because, nowadays, you give a young person a camera and they're pretty apathetic. They're not necessarily engaged with what's going on in their environment around them, and they're usually told to be pretty politically correct. So don't celebrate violence, don't celebrate drugs. But why not celebrate those things? Because when you're a kid, those are the things that you're dealing with in your life, and it's later in your life that you're making moral decisions, and you're transitioning into adulthood, which these kids weren't yet. Some of them were a bit more mature than others. But when you're a kid, the idea of smoking pot, breaking windows, dropping out of school, all this stuff, it doesn't correspond to what we think about as a morally responsible worldview. But you can't demand that of a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old. And why should we demand that of their films? And that's the beautiful thing about these films, is that they could present that worldview without that sort of moral obligation to be something else, or that they're I hate to kind of throw around a word that gets, I think, misused a lot, but they're pure, in that sense. I mean, they really are. And these kids had the best training in the world, from these teachers. They had the most supportive teachers. They got paid. They had all this beautiful equipment to work with. That doesn't happen today unless you pay a big tuition and go to a fancy school. So I think that's the main role of a film festival, is to bring back memory and to dialogue with history. Even if a film festival doesn't know it, that's what it's doing. That's what's so great about it. And even with mediocre festivals, which this one is not, this is a great festival, but even with bad film festivals, that dialogue is happening. It's always happening. When you put two films together, it's already a festival. It's already a choice. And that choice comes a dialogue, and of course in that choice also you can have older films, new films, films made by teenagers in the 60s, films made by 102-year-olds in Portugal in the 2000s. And these all they have to dialogue, they have to come together. That's our lives. That's what we're doing constantly, is we're interacting with history in the past. A thing we can demand from a film festival, we can expect and assume is there in a film festival. But yeah, Punto de Vista is great. I'm sure you've heard from a lot of the other guests too, because of the scale of it, because it's focused on really quality cinema. And when you have so much of a market for these things now, and it's so opened up to all these other different considerations, it's really refreshing to see something that's so focused.